Welcome back to the deep dive. Today, we're looking at something really significant. It's the Trump 2025 Gaza Peace Plan. We've got a pile of sources here, White House stuff, news articles, analyst reports, all digging into this, well, what they're calling a bold and final roadmap for peace. President Trump announced it back on September 29th, 2025.
And the timing, the timing is everything.
Exactly. This lands after nearly 2 brutal years of war starting October 2023. Gaza is, well, it's devastated. So our job today is to really unpack this framework. It's got 20 points. Sometimes people say 21. Depends how you count the security bits and figure out, is this a genuine bold vision or is it more of a, strategic illusion? Maybe just for show.
It's a huge lift, no question. You see it right away in the plan itself. It's promising this incredibly ambitious package. You've got ceasefire guarantees, a phased Israeli pullout, hostage releases finally, plus de-radicalization efforts, and this massive reconstruction plan. But what's fascinating here, truly, is how audacious the whole delivery was. It dropped right into this moment of, well, maximum tension, zero trust. And that deadline, that self-imposed October 5th deadline, it basically turned diplomacy into a ticking bomb.
Yeah, that urgency really makes it stand out. But let's get into the nuts and bolts first. Okay, so let's unpack this. What does this 20-point plan actually look like? Because the philosophy behind it, the White House docs are pretty clear. It's bringing back that economic peace through security idea. We heard that phrase a lot around the Abraham Accords time, didn't we?
That's right. The core idea, the trade-off, is pretty radical. Gaza gets this unprecedented economic boost, huge reconstruction funds, but only after giving ironclad security guarantees. This isn't just about stopping the fighting for a bit. It's about fundamentally changing Gaza's structure, kind of decoupling its economy from any militant power. Looking at the White House site, BBC reports, Times of Israel, they all highlight 5 key elements. First up, the staged Israeli withdrawal. So the IDF, the Israeli forces, they pull out of Gaza. But, and this is a big but, it's not automatic. It's strictly conditional. It's split into 3 phases and moving to the next phase. That depends entirely on hitting verifiable milestones. Things like, is the ceasefire holding? And crucially, are hostages actually being released?
Okay, so the withdrawal isn't guaranteed. It depends on results. That connects directly to the second point, right? The hostage exchange mechanism. That sounds like the trigger for everything else.
Absolutely essential. It's the immediate priority. Phase 1 hinges on it. The plan demands the immediate release of all surviving hostages held by Hamas. And in return, phased releases of Palestinian prisoners from Israeli jails. And the numbers here, they're staggering. The sources we looked at suggest the ratio could mean releasing potentially 7,000 or even more Palestinian prisoners.
7,000, wow. That's an incredible number. What does a figure like that do politically inside Israel for Netanyahu?
Oh, it's instant political dynamite for him. Releasing potentially thousands of prisoners, some possibly involved in attacks, that's a massive red line for his right-wing coalition partners and, frankly, for a lot of the Israeli public after the trauma of the last 2 years. Getting the hostages back is priority number 1, yes, but releasing 7,000 prisoners, that could easily bring down his government. So you immediately see how the plan could be DOA in Tel Aviv, even if Hamas somehow agreed. It shows just how much political capital the U.S. is asking, maybe demanding, Netanyahu spend.
Understood. It's a huge ask. But then there's the real structural game changer, the point Hamas rejected almost immediately, right? Number 3, complete demilitarization of Gaza.
Yeah, this is the absolute linchpin for the U.S. and Israel, non-negotiable. It means systematically taking apart Hamas's entire military setup. We're talking tunnel networks, weapon factories, command posts, everything. And crucially, under heavy third-party oversight. The plan says only limited police forces would be allowed, vetted internationally, operating under some kind of international framework. And the sources suggest the security job would fall to an ISF, an international security force. Maybe troops from Egypt, the UAE, maybe some European countries, but definitely not Hamas or PIJ, Palestinian Islamic Jihad.
So the aim isn't just stopping the shooting. It's basically ending Hamas as a military power, as a governing force in Gaza.
Precisely. It removes the ability for any armed group to hold military sway. Now, the last 2 points, they're the reward side of the equation, the economic payoff for accepting the security demands. 4th is transparent aid channels. Aid diversion has been a huge problem in Gaza for years, right? So the plan calls for really strict international supervision. The whole idea is to make sure the huge amounts of aid for humanitarian needs for reconstruction actually get to the people and projects, not siphoned off by armed groups. The sources even mention names like Tony Blair, people with experience in post-conflict situations, as potential overseers for this international commission, keeping the money away from groups like the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, who funded Hamas before.
Okay, and then the big prize, the ultimate carrot. Number 5, economic redevelopment and the terror-free zone. This is where the Singapore of the Middle East line comes in.
That's the grand vision, yeah. We're talking billions. Multi-billion-dollar reconstruction effort. Designed to transform Gaza from, let's be honest, a humanitarian catastrophe zone into a functioning, maybe even thriving economic area. The plan talks about huge infrastructure projects, a real commercial seaport, maybe tech hubs, desalination plants, stuff Gaza desperately needs and has never really had. And it's a massive, but this whole economic package is completely conditional. It's all or nothing. The money, which is expected to come mainly from Gulf states like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, it's explicitly tied to total verified disarmament. The phrase U.S. officials are apparently using is no security, no funds, no future. Stark.
That really sets up the core conflict, doesn't it? Okay, we've laid out the pieces of the plan, but what made this whole thing so dramatic wasn't just the content. It was that deadline, that incredible urgency. This is where it gets really interesting. The sheer speed of the diplomacy, or maybe anti-diplomacy, unveiled September 29th, 2025, and then, boom, no time for the usual back and forth. President Trump lays down this public ultimatum. Hamas gets until October 5th, just 7 days. Accept the terms or, quote, all hell will break loose. Take us through that pressure cooker week.
Well, that 7-day fuse just split the world's reaction down the middle, instantly. On one side, you had some, let's say, cautious optimism in diplomatic circles, because, look, after 2 years of nothing really moving, something was finally forcing the issue. But on the other side, you had human rights groups, a lot of analysts just slamming it, calling the plan fundamentally backward because it demanded, as they put it, disarmament before dignity. Basically, Palestinians had to give up all their leverage before getting any real guarantees, political or economic.
And Israel.
Yeah.
How did they react to being handed this ticking clock by their main ally?
Netanyahu's response was complicated. Publicly, he welcomed the structure, especially the tough security parts, the demilitarization, that played well domestically. But he was also careful, warning against, quote, premature concessions. Thinking about that prisoner release number or how fast troops might have to pull back in phase 1, he needed to look strong for his own political survival back home. And that caution apparently led to some real drama. The source material talks about leaks detailing this really tense phone call. Trump supposedly chewed Netanyahu out for being too negative, for potentially scuttling the deal, telling him to just spin it as a big win for Israeli security. Kind of shows you the raw personal pressure the White House was putting on Israel to just stick to the deadline.
Wow. Okay, so intense pressure on Israel. What about Hamas? How did they handle that impossible deadline, knowing what rejection likely meant for Gaza?
Well, by October 3rd, so just 4 days in, Hamas did signal, conditionally, that they'd engage. They did this through the usual mediators, Qatar and Egypt mainly. Just them participating was actually a big deal. They accepted the idea of a limited ceasefire, and they were okay with the immediate hostage exchange part. But, and here's the core problem, Gamer, they flat out rejected the demilitarization clause and the whole international security force idea. Their counter was, Israel has to pull out completely, immediately, and stop all flights over Gaza, including surveillance drones. So yeah, they engaged, but the fundamental disagreement over military control, still absolute.
So the core issue was still there. Who was working frantically behind the scenes during that critical weekend, trying to somehow bridge that gap before the October 5th deadline expired?
That's where the mediators really earned their keep. Egypt, Qatar, and the U.S. envoys. Names like Jared Kushner, Steve Witkoff were mentioned. They kicked off these intense indirect talks, mostly based out of Cairo, basically nonstop shuttle diplomacy. They were desperately looking for, wording tweaks, technical adjustments to timelines, anything both sides might just maybe accept. And the sources we read noted that some changes were apparently made specifically to calm down the security hardliners in Israel. Things like extending the timelines for proving disarmament had happened, meaning the IDF wouldn't have to pull back quite as fast as maybe first envisioned, giving Israel more time to feel sure the ISF could handle things and that Hamas's capabilities were really gone.
So we get to that weekend, October 4th and 5th. The deadline itself, what was the feeling? Was the world just holding its breath?
It was tense, definitely. But there was also this flicker of maybe guarded optimism in some capitals. We saw reports that Israeli military operations paused slightly, maybe suggesting both sides were testing the waters, giving the mediators a bit of space. At the same time, President Trump was out there, I think at a rally in Florida, already taking a victory lap, claiming the plan had, quote, more buy-in than any deal since Camp David, which was optimistic. But crucially, when midnight hit, the whole thing hadn't actually collapsed, and delegations were being pushed hard to show up for more formal talks in Cairo, set for October 6th. So in a way, the deadline worked. It forced them to the table, which is, well, pretty rare in this conflict.
Okay, so the pressure cooker tactic got people talking, at least initially. But let's step back now and look at the bigger picture. What does this all mean? You've got this massive U.S. push, incredible urgency, but you also have these deep, deep structural problems that have sunk every previous peace effort. So let's try to make a balance sheet. What are the actual reasons for optimism, however cautious, that this plan might achieve something, even just a pause?
Well, you could probably point to three main things giving a sliver of hope. First, just the engagement from both sides. I mean, despite the hatred, both Israel and Hamas are talking indirectly about this specific plan. Often in the past, one side or the other just rejected proposals out of hand. The fact they're both at the table, even with huge conditions, suggests maybe sheer exhaustion or necessity is playing a role. Maybe they feel military options are tapped out for now. Second, you can't deny the U.S. leverage. Trump's approach, the public threats, the private arm-twisting of allies dangling billions in reconstruction money, it created an urgency that just wasn't there before. Analysts seem to agree only that kind of intense pressure could have forced these parties together when trust is literally zero.
And the third reason gets right to the most immediate, desperate need on the ground, the humanitarian focus.
Exactly. For ordinary people in Gaza, that's the most compelling part. The promise of immediate aid surges, the transparent channels, hopefully getting around corruption, maybe led by credible international figures, and then the lure of that massive reconstruction effort. If, and it's a big if, those parts are implemented seriously, they could genuinely improve the horrific conditions people are living in. That could give the local population a real reason to want the ceasefire to hold.
But hope and pressure aren't enough, are they? What are those persistent structural flaws that make this whole thing such a massive gamble, the things that keep failing?
Oh, the flaws are fundamental. They haven't really changed in decades. The biggest one is still distrust and preconditions. It's the absolute core deadlock. Israel won't fully pull back until it feels totally secure, all hostages are home. Hamas won't disarm unless it gets guarantees of sovereignty, an end to the blockade, and no more military incursions. Since neither side can meet the other's must-have condition first, the plan kind of exists in this theoretical loop. The second big flaw is political fragility, and that's on both sides. In Israel, Netanyahu is walking a tightrope. Any sign of weakness, any concession seen as too generous, especially releasing potentially 7,000 prisoners, could collapse his coalition. You could see even harder line figures take over who'd just tear up the deal instantly.
And on the Palestinian side, you mentioned earlier the source material noted splits within Hamas. How does that make it hard for them to commit?
That internal friction is absolutely critical. Hamas isn't monolithic. You've basically got three main camps, and their interests don't always align. There's the military wing inside Gaza, focused on survival on the ground, the ideology of resistance. Then there's the political leadership in Doha, Qatar, juggling international relations, trying to secure funds, talking to regional powers. And then you have elements coordinating more closely with Tehran, focused on the bigger picture, the axis of resistance. So the leaders in Doha might see the economic benefits as crucial for survival, while commanders in Gaza might see disarmament as complete betrayal. Getting a single, unified, reliable commitment from an organization that fractured, it's incredibly difficult, maybe impossible.
And then there's the what happens next question, enforcement. We talked about this international security force, the ISF, but who really guarantees this thing holds, especially if U.S. attention wanders?
That's the third major structural weakness, vague enforcement. Ultimately, whether both sides stick to the deal relies hugely on continued active U.S. political will. And analysts point out that's a really shaky foundation, especially in a U.S. election year. Focus can shift overnight. A new administration could just ditch the whole roadmap. Without a truly independent, well-funded, long-term international security force that doesn't depend solely on U.S. backing, the deal is built on sand. And finally, there are the constant regional risks. This deal doesn't exist in a vacuum. We'll talk more about Iran. But any major flare-up between Iran and Israel or serious trouble in Lebanon that could instantly make the Gaza deal irrelevant. The whole thing could collapse just because of something happening next door.
Yeah, and that reality check is pretty stark when you look at the numbers from analysts. You mentioned Chatham House, Carnegie Endowment. Their projections aren't exactly optimistic.
No, they're sobering. These big think tanks, they're putting the chances of even getting a limited ceasefire, just stopping the active fighting, at maybe 40 to 50%. Okay, maybe coin flip odds. But the chances of a durable settlement, one that actually deals with the root causes, leads to that economic transformation they're talking about, that drops way down, like 20 to 30% probability. Maybe?
20 to 30% chance of lasting peace. Wow. That figure alone tells you almost everything you need to know about the mountain they're trying to climb. Why so low, even with all this U.S. muscle?
Well, I think analysts would say it's because the plan tackles security first, hoping economic incentives will somehow magically solve deep political grievances. It might be a sequencing error. If you don't address the underlying Palestinian need for dignity, for self-determination, the very things that fuel groups like Hamas in the first place, then any security fix is likely just temporary. The plan might buy a pause, maybe even a long one. But real peace needs political reconciliation, and this plan seems to deliberately sidestep that really hard political work.
Which brings us inevitably to the elephant, or maybe the 800-pound gorilla in the room, Iran. You just can't talk about Gaza without talking about Tehran's influence, right? The source material really emphasizes their long game, this axis of resistance. How deeply is Iran tangled up in all this?
Oh, Iran isn't just tangled, it's woven into the very fabric of the conflict, especially on the Palestinian resistance side. Ever since the 1979 revolution, they've positioned themselves as the main backer. The IRGC, the Revolutionary Guards, they're the main channel, funneling money, weapons, training. The estimates we saw suggest somewhere between, say, $100 million and maybe $350 million a year just to Hamas. That's not even counting what goes to other groups like PIJ or Hezbollah. And it's not just cash, it's expertise, it's Iranian drones, missiles. It lets these groups act as extensions of Tehran's own foreign policy, basically.
And this support isn't just theoretical. It led to actual direct conflict recently, didn't it?
It absolutely did. The sources really stressed you can't separate Gaza from the wider Iran-Israel shadow war. Remember that major escalation after Israel hit the Iranian consulate in Damascus back in April 2024. Tehran hit back with that huge wave of drones and missiles, over 300 of them. That quickly escalated into that sort of low-grade 12-day war between Iran and Israel around mid-2025. It showed Tehran is committed to its axis, and it proved, yet again, that any stability in Gaza is constantly vulnerable to a bigger regional blowup.
It's that proxy paradox you hear about. Iran gets to put pressure on Israel on the U.S., but without needing a direct head-to-head fight.
It's incredibly effective for them, and it gives them deniability.
Yeah.
They use Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis down in Yemen, militias in Iraq. It keeps Israel bogged down, U.S. resources tied up across the region. It's like a war of a thousand cuts. And crucially, they can usually deny direct responsibility for specific attacks. That makes it much harder for Israel or the U.S. to justify a massive retaliation against Iran itself, like hitting their nuclear sites or core territory.
But has this strategy been all upside for Iran? What are the consequences for them playing this long, expensive proxy game?
It's definitely a mixed bag. Ironically, relying so heavily on these militias has actually damaged Tehran's standing with some key Arab countries. Places like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, they prioritize stability, economic growth. They increasingly see Tehran, privately at least, as the main source of instability in the region. And that perception is pushing them, quietly, towards better relations with Washington, even Tel Aviv. It's to kind of laying the groundwork for this potential Abraham 2.0. Plus, Iran's proxies have taken some major hits. The sources highlighted the impact of assassinating key leaders like Hezbollah's Nasrallah or Hamas's Ismail Haniyeh, who was actually killed in Tehran. Those aren't small losses. They create gaps, disrupt operations, and show that the proxy shield isn't foolproof. It dents the whole axis of resistance effectiveness.
And yet, despite the international pressure, despite losing key commanders, the regime in Tehran seems to actually benefit domestically from keeping the conflict simmering.
They do. It's a grim calculation. They're facing huge economic problems at home, sanctions, public discontent. So the leadership uses the Palestinian cause, the anti-Israel sentiment, which is genuinely strong in Iran, to rally nationalist support. It's a classic diversion. One Iranian analyst quoted in the material put it very bluntly: every missile that lands in Gaza buys the regime another month of survival. It shows that for Tehran, this isn't just about foreign policy. It's a tool for managing domestic politics, which unfortunately means a lasting peace might actually be counter to their immediate interests.
Okay, stepping back from Gaza itself, this plan is clearly part of a bigger geopolitical game for the U.S. What's President Trump's strategic thinking here, and how's the rest of the world reading this very aggressive diplomatic play?
Yeah, for the Trump administration, it looks like it serves several goals. First, definitely reasserting American control over Middle East diplomacy, pushing Europeans, the UN, kind of to the side. The main aim seems to be isolating Iran further and cementing those normalization deals, U.S., Saudi Arabia, Israel, creating that strong anti-Iran bloc they envision with Abraham 2.0. Second, there's the political angle. It makes the U.S. look like a decisive peacemaker, which plays well domestically, especially heading towards the 2026 midterms. It's about projecting strength and effectiveness. And strategically, if they can somehow put the Israeli-Palestinian issue on the back burner, even temporarily, it frees up American resources, military, diplomatic, to focus on what they see as the bigger threats, China and Asia and Iran's nuclear ambitions. So maybe it's an efficiency play wrapped in peace rhetoric.
And the global reaction,
Yeah.
predictably, all over the map.
Very much split. In Europe, you see this division. Lots of governments are appalled by the human rights implications, the sort of imposed nature of the security terms. But others are more pragmatic, thinking maybe stability, any stability, is better than continued chaos. Russia and China. Publicly, they criticize it, call it unilateral, coercive. But you get the sense they privately don't mind seeing the U.S. potentially getting bogged down in another difficult Middle East initiative that might not succeed. It distracts the U.S.
And in the region itself, big difference between the street and the state.
Huge difference. On the Arab street, you see widespread anger. Big protests from Jordan to North Africa. People see it as a plan that tramples Palestinian rights for the sake of security. But behind closed doors, in the capitals of many key Arab states, the ones focused on their economies, like the Gulf monarchies or Egypt, there's probably a quiet sense of relief, or at least hope for a pause. They see the Gaza conflict as deeply destabilizing for their own interest. So they might be willing to go along with this transactional, security-first approach, even if they won't say so publicly.
Right. Let's shift gears slightly now to a really crucial comparison. This isn't the first final roadmap, is it? We absolutely need to understand how this 2025 plan compares to past efforts. Thinking about Oslo, the Abraham Accords, how different is this, really?
That historical context is so important. It really highlights how radical the Trump 2025 plan is, and also where the potential traps lie. Just look at the objectives. The Oslo Accords back in the 90s, that was all about mutual recognition, setting up the Palestinian Authority. But crucially, it postponed the toughest issues, borders, Jerusalem, refugees, kicked the can down the road. Then you had the Abraham Accords in 2020. That was purely state-to-state normalization, focused on Israel and certain Arab nations. It basically ignored the Palestinian issue altogether.
Whereas the Trump 2025 plan seems laser-focused on security, governance, reconstruction, but kind of bypasses the whole statehood question for now.
Exactly. The goal is immediate control, security, infrastructure, then maybe rebuilding. And the most radical difference is in those security demands. Trump 2025 demands full demilitarization, not partial, full, under an international force, the ISF. And it explicitly kicks Hamas out of any future governing role, pushing for some kind of technocratic committee instead, overseen internationally. Compare that to Oslo. Oslo allowed for Palestinian police, remember, limited forces, yes, and Israel kept overall security control in many areas, but there was some Palestinian security presence envisioned. This 2025 plan is way, way more intrusive on Palestinian military autonomy than anything seriously considered before by Palestinian leaders.
And the role of Palestinians themselves in crafting these deals, that seems to have shifted dramatically too, arguably shrinking over time.
Yeah, that's a critical point about who's actually at the table, about legitimacy. Oslo, for all its flaws, involved direct talks between Israel and the PLO, the recognized Palestinian leadership. They were partners in the negotiation, even if unequal ones. But the Trump 2025 plan, much like the Abraham Accords before it, really pushes Palestinians to the margins as negotiators. It relies more on the U.S., on regional powers to dictate terms. It favors these technical committees over politically empowered, maybe even elected, Palestinian representatives. You could say it's a peace plan imposed on Palestinians rather than negotiated with them. It potentially lacks that crucial element of local buy-in and agency.
Does that make it quicker to roll out, maybe? By sidelining the hardest political talks, even if it hurts long-term buy-in?
It probably does speed things up in the short term, absolutely. You don't get bogged down arguing about Jerusalem or refugees right away. But that's exactly the risk, isn't it? Think about why previous deals failed. Power imbalance, sure. Lack of real enforcement when U.S. attention shifted, yes. But critically, Oslo ultimately fell apart, partly because those final status issues, borders, Jerusalem, refugees, were never resolved. They festered. The Trump 2025 plan, by focusing so heavily on security and economics, while again deferring the core political questions, risks repeating that pattern. It might impose a temporary quiet, but does it solve the underlying conflict? Or just set the stage for the next failure by leaving the hardest political issues untouched?
Which brings us right back to where we started. The source material sums up the core challenge for this 2025 plan as needing impossible synchronization.
It's a great phrase because it captures the conflicting pressures perfectly. For this plan to have any chance, you need three things to happen all at once, and the odds of all three lining up are, well, slim. First, Hamas has to somehow accept total military dismantling without feeling like it's completely surrendering its identity and political role. Second, Israel has to trust an international force to keep it secure, letting go of its desire for direct military control over Gaza. And third, the U.S. has to stay deeply engaged politically, financially, without getting distracted, especially with domestic politics looming large.
It's a massive ask for everyone involved. And the sources remind us history here is just brutal. Every single final peace attempt, going way back to Camp David, all the roadmaps since, they've eventually just crumbled, turned out to be pauses, not solutions, ending, sadly, in more violence.
And that leads us to the final thought. The question maybe you listening should consider as we watch these Cairo talks or whatever comes next. If those past efforts, like Oslo, failed, partly because they left the really hard structural issues, final borders, Jerusalem, refugees unresolved, just kicked them down the road. Does this new, hyper-ambitious, security-first plan stand a better chance? Does relying on economic carrots and external control actually work? Or is it maybe just engineered to fail differently than the others, ultimately postponing, not preventing, the next round of conflict by avoiding that true, painful political reckoning?
Something to definitely mull over. Thanks for diving deep with us today on this incredibly complex and urgent issue. We will certainly keep watching developments closely.